all have lots of opportunities to see other things too, like right now, but here in general, and I really appreciate your coming here. I want to take us to someplace a little bit warmer. Tropical evergreen forests probably only naturally cover about 10% of Earth's land surface, which is not that much, but they have an unusually important impact on carbon cycling, both because of the amount of carbon they contain and the rapidity with which it cycles. So warming might be low relatively in the tropics, far lower than it's expected to be, for instance, in boreal regions. But even a 1% increase in respiration rates in the tropics is a larger impact than a 25% increase in the respiration of a boreal zone. They really have an important role in the carbon cycle. Now, how many of you don't know that tropical rainforests contain lots of biodiversity? Well, they also contain lots of carbon. They have large trees, and particularly, they have deep soils with surprisingly high organic matter contents. And they are being changed. Land use is rapid in the tropics and has been for some time. All those land use changes generate CO2. There's loss of soil carbon, decreased inputs and increased losses. And there's also decomposition or burning of the vegetation. So land use changes actually are an important contribution to the increasing atmospheric CO2 levels. This is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to explain it so you can get something out of it. Basically, it's broken down by regions, and the double bars reflect two different time periods. So let's look right here. This is Central and South America. Actually, I have a laser pointer. Ha ha. This is the deforestation carbon flux, land use change carbon flux. CO2 that's released as a result of land uses. These are sinks. This is the forest sink. There's still lots of forest in Amazonia, and it is taking up CO2 out of the atmosphere, net uptake. And because of its large area, there's a fair amount of uptake. This is regrowing forests. That is, in those cases where land is not converted to grasslands or agricultural lands, or is abandoned after use, trees growing also take up carbon. And so there's a fair amount of mitigation of the deforestation loss by uptake by terrestrial ecosystems. And that's really a picture of what I'm going to be talking about today. In 1987, the La Selva Biological Station recognized that they were becoming an isolated island surrounded by agricultural lands, and the biological value of the lands they held was rapidly diminishing. So they did a couple of things, one of which was to buy 2 large ranches adjacent to the property, which looked like this. This is one of them. But it had been in cattle pasture for a long time. Not managed pasture, just grow grasses and put cows on. Okay? And it was not what they thought, you know, a biological treasure, but it was land. And so a lot of effort went under the way that time to just like plant trees. And in fact, there really is a lot of potential in lands like this for restoration. Let's call it ecosystem services. Okay? Capture and consumption of water, biological diversity, soil restoration, forest production. Lots of possibility for these things, but not well developed. At that time, they received some money from the MacArthur Foundation to do a whole variety of things, one of which was to establish this thing called the Trials Project. And they did a lot of different work. One of the things they did was to kind of put head-to-head little-known locally trees for their potential as plantation species and compare them directly with, I call them typical tropicals, but think eucalyptus, Malina, trees that are genetically improved and planted everywhere on Earth. It's tropical. And they looked at some soil restoration. Well, they did find that, in fact, trees can grow very fast. Now, this is age 6, and you're getting trees from about 8 to 20 some centimeters in diameter, which is pretty good. They also found soil restoration, recovery, as it were. And then, basically, it was abandoned. They ran out of money. We got funded in 2003, found the plots. It is a collaboration. A lot of people were involved. Most of the funding came from NSF. And there are some of the people that were involved in 2008. Mike Ryan studies carbon allocation in Forest Service scientist. Ann Russell's scientist, soil scientist, did all our soils work. I'll refer to that. Carlos Menendez is a high school teacher. And we've got several of our project personnel that have various specialties. Ricardo manages the project there. Bill Parton, famous modeler for Century, the bearded guy. John Moore does soil arthropods. I just want to emphasize there's a lot of people that put something into this, not just me. I'm going to be summarizing things. So, quick recap of the local environment. It's rainy year-round, okay? It's warm year-round. I mean, the temperature plummets in the winter months, all the way down to 25. I bring this up because that's like world record rates of evapotranspiration. There's a lot of water coming in, but that is a lot of ET. It's going out the top, which is a bit surprising. Not very many places where that happens. In Brazil, there's some land areas that are similar, and they're all soybeans. Oxisols, although they've been called 3 different types of orders. Just to give you a different perspective, one of the first rules of ecosystems is take the bigger picture, or at least see it. And this is one of those bigger pictures. But La Selva exists right here. It's right at the toes of Volcan Barba. And this is the Atlantic coastal plain. And as you can imagine, this basically is all derived from volcanic materials. And that has a huge impact on the soils. They're not derived from other things. Volcanic soils are distinct. They used to be called their very own order. These are classified as oxasols, but they're still derived from volcanic materials, and they still maintain those characteristics. The natural vegetation of that entire coastal plain probably looked like this. This is the mature forest, full of stuff. What you can't see is how many palms there are. It's got an extraordinarily abundant palm fauna, flora, in the understory primarily. And so you see the trees, but there's a lot of other things there. It really is a tropical forest. And because they've preserved a corridor all the way up to the top of the volcano now, the fauna is still there, which is extremely nice. You know, I first met John Vandermeer at La Selva, my very first time in the tropics. I still call this John's Palm. It's strange how brains work. So I'm going to address a few questions. If we want to mitigate CO2, you want to grow trees, big trees, fast. This looks like the right place to do it. So we thought, just exactly how fast can we grow big trees? How much carbon do they sequester? How long do they sequester carbon? How much variability is there among species? We have the tropical rainforest biome, and we tend to model it like, you know, it's a very diverse biome full of diverse things, and this, it responds to climate, soils. But it's got lots of species. How much variability can individual species enforce upon a system, other factors being equal? And if you want to grow trees fast, you always run the potential of running out of nutrients. If you want to grow anything fast, you can run out of nutrients. Is that one of the things that slows us up? Well, we'll see. This was the nice thing about that original study. They actually set up an experiment. Each plot is 50 by 50 meters. Contains 1,000 trees, or did originally. They're replicated in 4 blocks. There were 12 plots per block, 11 different tree species. Some of those, acacia, pinus, what I call typical tropicals, genetically improved tropical timber species. But a lot of them are locally native species. And we established later, after the fact, not part of the experiment, but a mature forest reference plots. And this is trees planting, 1988. This is the hill slopes that were cleared for planting trees. Each block basically blanketed a hilltop. The nurseries were across the river, so they boated everything in. They had to chop. We just chopped everything for like 4 years. Those little seedlings didn't really stand a chance in that grass. But they grew up. These are overlays of the plot locations. Their bright green is a mimosoid legume, Pentaclothra macroloba, which is the most abundant tree in the local forest. Here's our forest reference plot. It's quite close. So let's talk about production. This is an 18-year-old tree. I'm going to be pretty brief here. I hope Bill doesn't mind. This is the quote as I remember it. I can show it every single time I give a seminar. It's the same methods. So there was basically, they were abandoned at age 6. We came back here at age 14. and relocated the plots and remeasured the trees. And we still had the original data sheets. So we have tree by tree data and heights and diameters that encompass this time period. The exotics all died. They were genetically engineered to grow rapidly, and they did. And then they died. Mostly, I'll be talking about locally native species. The other thing I want to point out is these are monospecific tree plantations. They're not like that diverse forest. But that may be what was planted. That's what we have. They've been heavily invaded by vegetation from the surrounding areas. Almost all is native. 56% of that is woody, 256 plant species. That's reasonable diversity. The overstories are still simple, but there's a lot of things coming up. I imagine most of you don't look at production numbers very often, and particularly when they're expressed in terms of carbon, but this is how much plant growth is occurring, and it's pretty rapid. A couple things, the diversity among species is not that terribly high. This is Hyaronima, Pentaclethra macroloba, the mimosoid legume. This is the pinus. It has since died. Virola and Vochysia. Not that that's important, except you might want to keep Pipa, Pinus palustris, in the middle. And the other thing I want to point out is we've got understory in wood and canopy is actually very important in terms of contributing to the total productivity, but the vast majority of the productivity is still overstory wood and overstory canopy. I thought maybe you'd understand if I put it in UMBS terms. Net primary production averaged 5.19 megagrams carbon per acre. Look at the same units too, but basically the production at UMBS of the old forest is down here. I suspect this is referring to total, whereas this is above ground, but we're probably about twice as high, just for comparison. And the variability in productivity is not very high. I mean, one of the things with modeling is you want to understand, you know, how much information do you have to put in? If you had to put in the information on what the species composition of our tropical rainforest biome does, it would be a lot of trouble. And to use that information, but in terms of uptake of carbon, it's not that big of a problem, just to call it a biome. It's not true with biomass. It's always useful to have a mature forest comparison. I mean, to me, if you study young forests, it's difficult to compare them with other young forests unless you can use the same yardstick or meter stick. And so I think a mature forest sites provide that meter stick. This is what a mature forest does. What does a plantation do? They're about 3 kilometers apart. Whoops! This is where the plantations are, and this is all the mature forest. This is the current housing cafeteria at La Selva. And you can see the surrounding lands. So in this figure, which I also was a little bit complicated, the mature forest average value is on the left, and the average plantation value is on the right. So for total tree biomass, for instance, 17 years, the biomass has recovered. Okay? Tree growth is still higher in the plantations. Leaf fall and litter fall are about the same. A little bit higher maybe in the plantations. This is a big difference. The net biomass increment, it's adding 6.4 megagrams carbon per hectare per year to the carbon stocks of the vegetation of the site. Whereas in the mature forest, it's 1.1. Okay? More soil respiration, more carbon going below ground. These are really preliminary numbers. The bottom line is it's like the plantations are more productive, are cycling more carbon than the mature forest on the same soils and the same climate. They obviously have a different history. But it's across the board. Big difference is really right here. How much is going down to roots? How much carbon sequestration? Well, obviously, those growing trees have a lot of carbon. I mean, trees are solid air. You know, it's CO2 packed into wood. Ash contents, what comes out of the soil, really? 5%. They're really solid air. So all that tree growth is carbon sequestration. And this is above ground and below ground fine roots, coarse roots, understory wood, overstory wood, and the canopies, overstory canopies. So really you see where wood is where you're really stacking carbon away. The trees are growing. We're also getting accumulation in the soil, but we're like 2 orders of magnitude lower. But for all, that is, throw everything together, there is sequestration, but it does vary among species. This is the pinus, okay, which isn't native and has since died, just like that. Turned brown, lost its needles, and the tree wood just disappeared, leaving hollow shells of bark. Fungi love La Selva. So we could do total carbon pools, and these include soil organic carbon, which is the major pool. Lots of carbon in the soils. These are volcanic soils, and they hold carbon really well. And above ground biomass is another large contributor. But basically, you do all that just to be able to figure out what the carbon balance is. And this is the accumulation rate. That is how much carbon is being added to the site every year. This is over the first 17-year period. So this integrates over the 17-year lifespan of the plantations to say what's the... It's not a linear trend, but it's just assume a linear trend. And this is the 15 to 17-year average. So we're over the peak is what this means. We're not as fast as it was at one earlier time period, but still substantial. And there's another number you probably don't have any way to interpret. But that's pretty good. Let me provide some interpretation. Now, I know not anybody is average, right? That's the thing about averages. Nobody's average. But if you consider yourself a part of this society, of our American society, and your equal contribution to that society in terms of fossil fuel CO2 production is that right there. Almost 5 megagrams of CO2c per person per year. Now, I know you don't exhale that much, okay? But everything that supports this society and the economy in this nation contributes to that number. Now, remember this? Look at that. I've really been trying to convince OTS that they should sell guilt-free tickets. You know, you grow a hectare of trees, wonderful thing, all the advantages, the benefits that accrue. And you can just drive your car without any guilt at all. And it persists. It's a very long-term sink. Maybe longer. This is when I stopped doing the calculation. So, just a quick summary. Good time to stop and breathe a minute. Ask any questions you might have. 17 years to get back to mature forest biomass from pasture. It was a lot of work. I had to grow seedlings, plant them, chop. There is variability among species, but the biomass is still dominated by the planted trees. We didn't really find any large differences or meaningful differences at all in root-shoot ratios. About 20% of the total biomass is below ground. Seems to be independent of the species. Carbon sequestration, 1 hectare equals 1 American's year. Should I go back over anything or revisit? Yeah.
Jim, what vegetation emerges after these pines die? Is it a forest? Is it a young seedlings that have...
That's a good question. So this has happened with one species like after another. That's where it happened to all the exotics now. And it has happened to a couple of the native species too. But basically all that regrowth that's in the understory takes over. Now, more than half the stems and species are woody, but they do tend to be secondary forest species. So we have mature forest growing there. We have exactly 1 Wilfia in all those plots we have. They're coming in very slowly, but it's woody vegetation, lots of climbers, and some other things too. So it's a real mixture. It eventually comes to forest, but it could be hundreds and hundreds of years. I was going to say something else about that, but I've forgotten, so that's fine. That's a good question. Yeah?
You showed that the biomass was the same in the mature forest and the 17-year-old forest, but that, I guess, net primary productivity was higher in the younger forest. Do you have an explanation?
That's right.
For why that?
More rapid turnover. Because they are growing, for instance, trees, if you don't replace, basically you drop lower leaves and you put them up above when you're growing tall. That's how trees grow taller. They've got to just shed the lower leaves and branches, and they put new branches and leaves up high. And so it's part of growth is to do a lot of shedding, I guess. And that all adds to productivity. Plus, they are growing more. And it's probably because everything is younger. In mature trees, I think there's a geriatric effect. A lot of the trees are older. They probably have fungal diseases. And you're just tolerating a lot more stress and senility. Did they see another one? Yeah, John.
I'm curious, your reflection just now about the biodiversity that's coming into the plantation.
Uh-huh.
Because thinking about Robin Chasden's work,
Uh-huh.
what she finds in second growth forests very, very quickly in the same area, where you get species from the primary forest coming into the understory very, very rapidly in the
Mm-hmm.
forest. So is the difference between what you just said, that there's not all that much encroachment of primary forest species, is that due to the fact that these are monocultural plantations, whereas Robin is studying second growth forests, or what?
No, I don't think. I think it's really a location effect. These were in the middle, really, of old pasture land. And if you study, so we've got plots right next to mature forest there, off on the way edges. And they get all those things. Now, in terms of what's coming in, the vast majority is dispersed by birds. You know, and so berries, things that birds eat, and bats, seem to be very, very abundant. And I think that also is a reflection probably of spatial location of things. there's no question that mature for even palms, which I don't know how those seeds get around. You know, they weigh a lot. But we also have, you know, great macaws in a tree very nearby. So they're, you know, the structure supports birds.
But you don't think it could be, you don't think it could be possibly due to due to the nature of a monocultural plantation as opposed to what's effectively a polycultural plantation, which is second growth forest? I mean, there's more attractiveness for birds and mammals also in the second growth forest than there is in a monocultural plantation.
No, I don't think that's true. Not when you don't clean your plantations, which ours aren't. They've got these growing understories that, you know, we're like a third of the productivity now, and they are taking over. So, you know, it could be there. We see monkeys in the plantation. We see pigs. We see lots of herps, and we see lots of birds. It's, you know, I mean, Virolas have got big seeds, and it attracts a lot of things. It's
Comment in terms of sequestration here. You said 1 acre is equivalent to 1 American's yearly production of fossil fuel-based carbon. But the time frame of the sequestration is relevant. You can't just drive as much as you want in order to make the trees. To really make it work, you have to take that peg there and fossilize it, bury it in the ground for 257 years to actually sequester it.
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated, and you get into that. It's, like I said, this works for 20 years, and then it's done. It's like your certificate runs out. And I don't really know that. That's all the time that we've put into it. But for that time period, you're basically taking up as much CO2 and putting it into wood, which mostly wood, which is stored for a while. Now, granted, wood eventually dies and matures. Those trees are going to, you know, they're going to hit some state where they are no longer adding any more carbon there. Maybe the soil, some people argue that the only carbon you sequester is in the soil. And that's a much, much lower rate. But, you know, those are policy issues. I think that growing trees, which are actually 50% carbon, is not a bad way to not just help promote carbon sequestration, but to establish or maintain biodiversity and soil health and hydrologic fitness and a variety of other things. It would be best if that wood were cut and made into houses that lasted 100 years. But that's a different way. Oh, that would be good too. Bury it in the deep ocean. And then you've got, you know, cold, wood does not disappear in cold waters. They pulled up Viking ships, right? They can still sail them. That would be great. Oh, yes.
Another question. So, the secondary, more diverse forests, you really don't have any comparison with similar age secondary forests. You really have all monocultures.
Okay, so
What's the
in the original study design, there are 12 plots per block. 11 of them were planted. One of them wasn't. So, you know, you're always fighting when you do a project, how much funding do I have and where do we put this effort? So there's actually a control in every single one of those blocks, which is an unplanted control. So somebody's got to go out and measure those. The problem is, you know, they're strongly impacted by the fact that they are surrounded by plantations. You know, so it's not still reflective of a secondary forest that's in a piece of forest. But these were pastures. How are we doing here? Okay, I've got 3 more minutes. We'll go through this quickly. There is a potential when you're stacking a lot of carbon away that you're also stacking away a lot of nutrients, because nothing is pure carbon, not biomass anyway. Living organisms contain all 16 essential elements in plants. And all of those are being sequestered at the same time carbon is. So there is great concern, and there has been, particularly with respect to face studies, that a negative feedback has to establish, has to arise, based on nutrient limitation. Productivity requires nutrients. So does biomass accumulation. Okay? It's too bad the lights are here. It would be easier to see the soils
Do you
if
want
they
those
were
lights down?
not. But this is probably the only picture I have of the soils. Basically, they're deep and uniform. And in terms of depth, we don't know. Probably bottomless for all practical purposes. Nope, can't see them very well. They're lovely soils, though. I never see a puddle. There's an awful lot of nitrogen. I mean, take my word for it, that is a heck of a lot of nitrogen. And that's in biomass. These are nitrogen-rich forests. I think we have the fastest recorded nitrogen cycling rates in any terrestrial ecosystem anywhere. So in Iowa, they like to grow corn, and they like to feed it really heavily. They generally add a maximum of maybe 120 kilos per hectare. And that's way too much. It all runs down the Mississippi. But we're talking 400. The only comparable information I could find was from Puerto Rico, and that's about 150. The other thing is the mean residence time. Okay, classic ecosystems, 43 years. What does that mean? Well, generally the mean residence time reflects the size of the pool. For instance, the mean residence time of water in Lake Superior has got to be much longer than the mean residence time of water in Lake Erie. Okay, 2 lakes, same watershed. Well, this is a bit of a conundrum because we not only have lots of nitrogen, but it's cycling incredibly fast, and we have huge pools of nitrogen, and yet a very, very short residence time. You could ignore all this stuff. I want to get down to here. Average N uptake across 4 species, 340 kilos per hectare per year of nitrogen. That is just, you know, that's 3 times what we put on corn in Iowa. 3 times. And it's not like it's falling from the sky. Maybe 10 kilos, maybe 7. Through fall, there's some leaching from canopies that brings in some extra nitrogen to the soil, but then you've got leaching from the soil. Nitrogen gas losses. N2 is a challenge. Okay, so we have to just pretend like there is no N2 production. That helps. And, but we still have this biomass accumulation rate of 50 to 60 kilos per hectare per year, depending upon the site. So you've got this coming in and this going out and this coming in and this going out. You know, you're only getting 10. But it's accumulating in vegetation 5 to 6 times as fast. So something's going on, and it's likely these deep carbon-rich soils are a source. In fact, these are measurements from these are sites that were never planted to trees, the same pasture, but they also haven't been grazed for the past, 50 years. No, they haven't been grazed since 1987. Forest, here's Vochysia, here's Pinus and Pentaclethra. Look at that. This is our mimosoid legume and Hieronyma. But this is how much nitrogen is accumulating in biomass. The question is, you know, there's a lot there. Could this have come from here? And it looks like yes. That basically, at least in these species, What they have simply done is taken nitrogen out of the soil and put it into biomass. The problem is right here. There's no difference in the amount of nitrogen or carbon in the soil in Vochisia stands as in pasture or forest. So soil mining doesn't really seem to be very likely. Or it could have occurred and been balanced by something else. But certainly, at least for 4 of those 5 species, soil mining event is an important source. And there's lots of nitrogen in the soils. They're very good soils, very deep soils. Now, on the other hand, I've already showed you there's actually carbon sequestration. So you're losing nitrogen, gaining carbon. You're expanding the C to N ratio. That's very common in forest restorations, or forest recoveries, regrowth of forest. No evidence of any soil mining of nitrogen in Vochisia. So that brings up the question. This has been one of the most troubling questions. It's been around for as long as any other, like how widespread is asymbiotic N fixation. Certainly the genes are present, but whether the whole machinery is there or not is always a question. One of my former mentors at Los Alamos said, oh, if you put a tennis shoes in that machine, you're going to find fixation. I mean, there is, you know, it might be everywhere. It takes carbon, but these are carbon-rich sites, you know. So that's the best we can do at this rate. Why is there less nitrogen? And this is the only species we have that's a nitrogen fixer. It's got nodules. It's very abundant in the forest. And yet it seems to have depleted the soils in pure form. Once again, thanks to all the people that assisted, and thank you for your attention. And I'll be happy to take any other questions.